The gulls were flying, the ships were sailing out of the west and north. She sat high up in her cushioned window, merrily gazing forth. She took her lute with its broad blue ribbon and daintily touched the strings, till the room was full of trills and quavers as a wood when the robin sings. Rosebuds blowing on fields of silver was her gown of a rich old stuff, and her sweet face looked like a rose from its calyx out of her royal ruff. She beat the time with her tiny slipper and sang as she watched the sea. I have a ship that the fairies have laden a-sailing the ocean to me. While she was singing, the ships kept sailing, but hers came never in sight, with its tall black masts on the rim of the ocean, though she watched till the fall of night. But she fingered her lute with its broad blue ribbon, and her singing was just as gay. I have a ship that the fairies have laden, it reached not the port today. And that was Expectancy by Mary Wilkins Freeman, who wrote a few poems. And yeah, I've been enjoying doing them as cold opens. And at break times and stuff. Hello, I'm Sam and you are listening to Chilliteracy, where we have some more ghost stories tonight for you to listen to and enjoy on, certainly here in the UK, a really lovely, basically summertime evening. The weather has switched in like the last 2 weeks from, ooh, can't believe it's still this cold in April, to, May. Spring is here and already almost summer. The sky's been just like a clear, unbroken blue. It's that gorgeous, like, pale grey blue shade this evening that I absolutely love. No sign of a cloud up there. It's really nice. And yeah, I thought we would continue with this because frankly I've been enjoying reading these stories, and we're nearly actually through the book, which is very cool. I like finishing things as someone who does it so rarely. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting on with that. We have 2 stories tonight. Actually, while I think of it, I have the text ready for the first one, which I will pin at the top of chat. It shall be The Lost Ghost. I will just do it like this. And do that. Boop. But yeah. How is everybody? How are you? I appreciate that this is probably going to be a slightly quieter night in here than usual. Not least Eurovision is on, and you know, I get the impression that a number of people quite enjoy Eurovision, sort of into that. So yeah, I expect people are probably watching that and paying it some close attention. Also Dave is streaming at the moment as well, which I hope, well, it seemed to be going well, although it's a shame he's got some of them tech gremlins, but I think again that's, well, both the game doesn't seem to capture very well on OBS. That's Sunder the Forest for those not watching. OBS doesn't seem to entirely play very nicely with it. I guess like survival crafty games can be quite sort of PC resource intensive, use a lot of processor and RAM to keep doing things. But also, yeah, OBS seems to have problems capturing it, and also running 2 streams off it is, I think, what's pushing things. Friend in the other room is VPN'd into the iPlayer, or into iPlayer, watching Graham Norton's commentary. Nice. Yeah. Parola, you ignore Eurovision as much as you can or avoid. I don't mind it. I'm not into it, but I'm not against it, I think. But that is fair. That's completely your choice. We like, as a child we used to like have it on the TV, and then have the radio on because you had Terry Wogan doing the sarcastic Irishman commentary, which seems to have been, that's kind of become the thing. He would just sit there sounding like he was getting increasingly drunk and just taking the piss out of each new act that came up, and then when he died they handed it over to Graham Norton under the sort of the premise of, here, you do the same thing. So we just kind of listened to that. Regularly ask your Eurovision inclined friends to exclude you from any related posts. Damn. Yeah, I think it's interesting to me seeing how it's grown in the last few years. Like it did feel like it was this like very highly eccentric European like cross section of every country just being as wonderfully camp and flamboyant as they can be. And then over the last few years, it's, I think, is Australia included? Was Australia included? I'm not entirely certain, but I feel like the borders opened up a little bit, and now America's getting in, and they're like, oh, what was that weird, silly thing? Oh, no, we kind of like this, and it's just grown from there. Noisy for some reason, probably because people go, so, yeah, I guess. I am definitely someone who, when I see like feverish hype around a thing, it tends to put me off more than it draws me in, and that's a me problem. Like that's not necessarily something I feel is a healthy habit, because like that, I don't know why I do that. And I know if you're the same, then when people go just like feral for something, it tends to put me off, which I get that I also do in other people when I'm like, oh, you got to play this game's amazing, it's actually just the best game ever made, you got to play it. And I appreciate that the people who I'm saying that to are probably going, yeah, no, I'm not. So maybe it's just like a natural human reaction for a lot of people. You're just a grump, fair. And yeah, like if you if you can like identify and acknowledge that, then that's Aussie loves it apparently. Yeah, well that's the thing. Again, it's like it's watching the US reaction that's gone from like, what is this? Well, we don't know what this is. What is this, you weird Europeans being all eccentric and weird and colourful and we like this now, and then in a few years it's going to be, this is ours now. This is the American Eurovision. And then it's all over. Reason to hype your stuff. You're looking forward to Good Omens Season 2. Well, that's written by John Finnemore, I think, in part. So, that's going to be good. You saw some rumours about the US wanting their own Eurovision. Everybody on Tumblr was like, nope. Yeah, like, it's... I feel like it would lose some of the tongue-in-cheekness. I feel like it would be less self-aware than it currently is. I don't know. This is getting into far more subjects than I was expecting to at the start. I'm pretty sure John Finnemore's involved in Good Omens Season 2. Because when they announced it, everyone was like, what? Without Sir Terry? Neil Gaiman, what do you have to say about this? And then John Finnemore was like, hi, I'm writing on this one. And a lot of people went, oh, he's going to absolutely bang this. This is going to be the perfect TV show. Yes, great. You had to find a filter for Twitter to block Mello, Swedish short for Melodifestivalen. Okay. Because a lot of people were like, oh, right, yeah. Yeah, that's... And again, like, yeah, I get that response myself. Not as in get, just like I understand, as in I literally have that response. But unlike this week, you've obviously had Tears of the Kingdom coming out. And again, like the reflex in me is almost like, I hate your stupid sandcastle, it sucks, it's rubbish, don't, blue, boo, go away with it. And it's like, that's a thing for me to question and be aware of. And that's where I've tried to recondition myself that my response should be, cool. Like, hell yeah. I love that feverish hype and that excitement for things. It's frankly been a long time since I felt it over a video game. So yeah, like actually seeing people get like just really good for you. I hate it. Yeah, like actually being able to see people get really like launch day hyped and excited for a video game. Hell yeah, absolutely. That's excellent. That's like I want that for myself. And so yeah. I'm not going to read that out, Lady Mephistopheles, but I know someone who just winced on reading that. Wow. Yeah, like I that's the thing. I get hype putting people off because it puts me off too. And again, like if it's something you can recognize that you do and you don't want to like feel that, then it's good that you can recognize it and kind of just take steps to mitigate that negativity. And because ultimately, people enjoying things doesn't do any, well, mostly people enjoying things doesn't do anybody else any harm, unless the thing you enjoy is doing other people harm. But that's, that's a whole other discussion. So yeah, I try to adopt that attitude of, hell yeah, good for you, and then I go back and do my own thing. And that's probably the healthiest approach that I've found yet. But yeah, we're getting into a big old topic for the start of this. This is more of a like chiller tea conversation, I think. Also, hello Lucy, sneaking in there. I hope that you have had a good day, as it sounds like it's been reasonably pleasant, and that you waved as you drove past. You didn't have to do that. You're glad you didn't pay any attention to the hype when Stranger Things was new, because then maybe you wouldn't have given it a chance. You love it and that would have been said. Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. Like, when it can go too far and like, actually put you off something that you would otherwise like. I think actually the other example for me at the moment is Succession. Because, good grief, when there is a new episode, every single person on my Twitter feed lights up with just reactions to Succession, and maybe it's just a picture of a man in a suit wearing a baseball cap in a grey office and it is dimly lit, and people just going absolutely feral for how he looks, or him saying okay when Jim said okay, and I'm cry emojis. Like, I don't, and that kind of like, yeah, just fury for something, it tends to put me off. Annoyingly, I would probably really, really like Succession if I actually sat down and watched it. And so what I need to do is like put some distance between myself and this reaction. Like let the show finish, give it some time to air out. Everyone moves on to something else, and I'm going to come along afterwards and go, "Oh yeah, cool show." Started watching it, and so far you're indifferent. That is the first kind of middling reaction I've seen to it. Like, I know it's by Jesse Armstrong, I think, who Brits and UK aware people will know from things like Peep Show. I forget what other shows. He wrote one of, for me, not having seen all of it, and one of the best episodes of Black Mirror, the entire history of You. You don't like the majority of the characters? Yeah, that sounds like the kind of comedy that he writes, which is why I think I would like it. I've not watched much Peep Show, but I get the sense of humour, I get the comedy there, and I feel like, I would enjoy it if I actually sat down and watched it. Doesn't help that you often dislike the things that other people go crazy about. Fair enough then, yeah. Peep Show is also the kind of show you don't like. Yeah, exactly. And I feel like as well, another thing that I've seen people commenting for the audiences of that is that not everyone knows that it's a comedy, and people tend to treat it more like it's a drama, and it's like, no. That's the kind of comedy that he writes. It's very straight-faced satire stuff, no laugh track, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I feel like I'm getting way into this conversation, but really what I should be doing is making plans to actually read you all the story. The first of which is pinned at the top of chat. It is called The Lost Ghost. And yeah, I give myself a bit of a content warning to pass on for this one. Firstly, like a number of these, it is not a cheery story. It is kind of a sad story. And like specific content warnings that I want to say is there is some kind of talk of pretty dire neglectful parenting and sort of child abuse. This is me trying to like give descriptions without giving spoilers, because I like to let the story tell its own story, frankly. Continually building your quack and pixel art space while listening. Nice. So yeah, like broad strokes. Yeah, child abuse / neglectful parenting. So do please, like, be advised if that is something that might be upsetting, distressing to you. If that is something that's going to be a bit too much, please don't feel obliged to listen. Skip on to the second story, which doesn't have... Quickly checking the second story. No, it doesn't have anything like that. That's all good. I'm playing House Flipper. Nice. House Flipper's good. But yeah, I think if we are all ready, and am I all ready? I think I'm all ready. Then let us have a story. Actually, I'm gonna sit up like a proper human. Even as the chair's still gonna creak, and Joey's asleep in a box behind me, so he's going to interrupt at some point. Right. Oh yeah, I've got to do accents again. Great. Okay. Well then, if we're all sitting comfortably, or even if we're not, this is The Lost Ghost. Mrs. John Emerson, sitting with her needlework beside the window, looked out and saw Mrs. Rhoda Meserve coming down the street, and knew at once by the trend of her steps and the cant of her head that she meditated turning in at her gate. She also knew by a certain something about her general carriage, a thrusting forward of the neck, a bustling hitch of the shoulders, that she had important news. Rhoda Meserve had always had the news as soon as the news was in being, and generally Mrs. John Emerson was the first to whom she imparted it. The two women had been friends ever since Mrs. Meserve had married Simon Meserve and come to live in the village. Mrs. Meserve was a pretty woman, moving with graceful flirts of ruffling skirts. Her clear-cut, nervous face, as delicately tinted as a shell, looked brightly from the plumy brim of a black hat at Mrs. Emerson in the window. Mrs. Emerson was glad to see her coming. She returned the greeting with enthusiasm, then rose hurriedly, ran into the cold parlour, and brought out one of the best rocking chairs. She was just in time, after drawing it up beside the opposite window to greet her friend at the door. "Good afternoon," said she. "I declare, I'm real glad to see you. I've been alone all day. John went to the city this morning. I thought of coming over to your house this afternoon, but I couldn't bring my sewing very well. I'm putting the ruffles on my new black dress skirt." "Well, I didn't have a thing on hand except my crochet work," responded Mrs. Meserve, "and I thought I'd just run over a few minutes." "I'm real glad you did," repeated Mrs. Emerson. "Take your things right off. Here, I'll put them on my bed in the bedroom. Take the rocking chair." Mrs. Meserve settled herself in the parlour rocking chair, while Mrs. Emerson carried her shawl and hat into the little adjoining bedroom. When she returned, Mrs. Meserve was rocking peacefully and was already at work hooking blue wool in and out. "That's real pretty," said Mrs. Emerson. "Yes, I think it's pretty," replied Mrs. Meserve. "I suppose it's for the church fair?" "Yes. I don't suppose it'll bring enough to pay for the worsted, let alone the work, but I suppose I've got to make something." "How much did that one you made for the fair last year bring?" 25 cents. "It's wicked, ain't it?" "I rather guess it is. It takes me a week every minute I can get to make one. I wish those that bought such things for 25 cents had to make them. Guess they'd sing another song. Well, I suppose I oughtn't to complain as long as it is for the Lord, but sometimes it does seem as if the Lord didn't get much out of it." "Well, it's pretty work," said Mrs. Emerson, sitting down at the opposite window and taking up her dress skirt. "Yes, it's real pretty work. I just love to crochet." The two women rocked and sewed and crocheted in silence for 2 or 3 minutes. They were both waiting. Mrs. Meserve waited for the other's curiosity to develop in order that her news might have, as it were, a befitting stage entrance. Mrs. Emerson waited for the news. Finally, she could wait no longer. "Well, what's the news?" said she. "Well, I don't know as there was anything very particular, hedged the other woman, prolonging the situation. Yes, there is. You can't cheat me, replied Mrs. Emerson. Now, how do you know? By the way you look. Mrs. Meserve laughed consciously and rather vainly. Well, Simon says my face is so expressive I can't hide anything more than 5 minutes no matter how hard I try, said she. Well, there is some news. Simon came home with it this noon. He heard it in South Dayton. He had some business over there this morning. The old Sergeant place is let. Mrs. Emerson dropped her sewing and stared. You don't say so. Yes, it is. Who to? Why, some folks from Boston that moved south to Dayton last year. They haven't been satisfied with the house that they had there. It wasn't large enough. The man has got considerable property and can afford to live pretty well. He's got a wife and his unmarried sister in the family. The sister's got money, too. He does business in Boston, and it's just as easy to get to Boston from here as from South Dayton, and so they're coming here. You know, the old Sergeant house is a splendid place. Yes, it's the handsomest house in town, but, Simon said they told him about it, and that he just laughed. Said he wasn't afraid, and neither was his wife and sister. Said he'd risk ghosts rather than little tucked-up sleeping rooms without any sun like they've had in the Dayton house. Said he'd rather risk seeing ghosts than risk being ghosts themselves. Simon said they said he was a great hand to joke. Oh, well, said Mrs. Emerson. It is a beautiful house, and maybe there wasn't anything in those stories. It never seemed to me they came very straight anyway. I never took much stock in them. All I thought was, if his wife was nervous. Nothing in creation would hire me to go into that house Nothing in creation would hire me to go into a house that I'd ever heard a word against of that kind, declared Mrs. Meserve with emphasis. I wouldn't go into that house if they would give me the rent. I've seen enough of haunted houses to last me as long as I live. Mrs. Emerson's face acquired the expression of a hunting hound. Have you? She asked in an intense whisper. Yes, I have. I don't want any more of it. Before you came here? Yes, before I was married, when I was quite a girl. Mrs. Meserve had not married young. Mrs. Emerson had mental calculations when she heard that. Did you really live in a house that was... she whispered fearfully. Mrs. Meserve nodded solemnly. Did you really ever see anything? Mrs. Meserve nodded. You didn't see anything that did you any harm? No, I didn't see anything that did me harm looking at it in one way, but it don't do anybody in this world any good to see things that haven't any business to be seen in it. You never get over it. There was a moment's silence. Mrs. Emerson's features seemed to sharpen. Well, of course I don't want to urge you, said she, if you don't feel like talking about it. But maybe it might do you good to tell it out, if it's on your mind, worrying you. I try to put it out of my mind, said Mrs. Meserve. Well, it's just as you feel. I never told anybody but Simon, said Mrs. Meserve. I never felt as if it was wise, perhaps. I didn't know what folks might think. So many don't believe in anything they can't understand, and they might think my mind wasn't right. Simon advised me not to talk about it. He said he didn't believe it was anything supernatural, but he had to own up that he couldn't give any explanation for it to save his life. He had to own up that he didn't believe anybody could. Then he said he wouldn't talk about it. He said lots of folks would sooner tell folks my head wasn't right than to own up they couldn't see through it. I'm sure I wouldn't say so, returned Mrs. Emerson reproachfully. You know better than that, I hope. Yes, I do, replied Mrs. Meserve. I know you wouldn't say so. Excuse me. And I wouldn't tell it to a soul if you didn't want me to. Well, I'd rather you wouldn't. I won't speak of it even to Mr. Emerson. I'd rather you wouldn't even to him. I won't. Mrs. Emerson took up her dress skirt again. Mrs. Meserve hooked up another loop of blue wool. Then she begun. Of course, said she, I ain't going to say positively that I believe or disbelieve in ghosts, but all I tell you is what I saw. I can't explain it. I don't pretend I can, for I can't. If you can, well and good. I shall be glad, for it will stop tormenting me as it has done and always will otherwise. There hasn't been a day nor a night since it happened that I haven't thought of it, and always I have felt the shivers go down my back when I did. That's an awful feeling, Mrs. Emerson said. Ain't it? Well, it happened before I was married, when I was a girl and lived in East Wilmington. It was the first year I lived there. You know my family all died 5 years before that, I told you. Mrs. Emerson nodded. Well, I went there to teach school, and I went to board with Mrs. Amelia Dennison and her sister, Mrs. Bird. Abby, her name was, Abby Bird. She was a widow. She had never had any children. She had a little money. Mrs. Dennison didn't have any. And she had come to East Wilmington and bought the house they lived in. It was a real pretty house, though it was very old and run down. It had cost Mrs. Bird a good deal to put it in order. I guess that was the reason they took me to board. I guess they thought it would help along a little. I guess what I paid for my board about kept us all in victuals. Mrs. Bird had enough to live on if they were careful, but she had spent so much fixing up the old house that they must have been a little pinched for a while. Anyhow, they took me to board, and I thought I was pretty lucky to get in there. I had a nice room, big and sunny and furnished pretty, the paper and paint all new and everything as neat as wax. Mrs. Dennison was one of the best cooks I ever saw, and I had a little stove in my room, and there was always a nice fire there when I got home from school. I thought I hadn't been in such a nice place since I lost my own home, until I had been there about 3 weeks. I had been there about 3 weeks before I found it out, though I guess it had been going on ever since they had been in the house, and that was most 4 months. They hadn't said anything about it, and I didn't wonder, for... Excuse me, loud motorbike. For there they had just bought the house and had been to so much expense and trouble fixing it up. Well, I went there in September. I begun my school the first Monday. I remember it was a real cold fall, and there was a frost the middle of September, and I had to put on my winter coat. I remember when I came home that night. Let me see, I began school on a Monday, and that was 2 weeks and the next Thursday. I took off my coat downstairs and laid it on the table in the front entry. It was a real nice coat, heavy black broadcloth trimmed with fur. I had had it the winter before. Mrs. Bird called after me as I went upstairs that I ought not to leave it in the front entry for fear somebody might come in and take it, but I only laughed and called back to her that I wasn't afraid. I never was much afraid of burglars. Well, though it was hardly the middle of September, it was a real cold night. I remember my room faced west, and the sun was getting low, and the sky was a pale yellow and purple, just as you see it sometimes in the winter when there is going to be a cold snap. I rather think that was the night the frost came the first time. I know Mrs. Dennison covered up some flowers she had in the front yard anyhow. I remember looking out and seeing an old green plaid shawl of hers over the verbena bed. There was a fire in my little wood stove. Mrs. Bird made it, I know. She was a real motherly sort of woman. She always seemed to be the happiest when she was doing something to make other folks happy and comfortable. Miss Dennison told me that she had always been so. She said she had coddled her husband within an inch of his life. It's lucky Abby never had any children, she said, for she would have spoiled them. Well, that night I sat down beside my little fire and ate an apple. There was a plate of nice apples on my table. Mrs. Bird put them there. I was always very fond of apples. Well, I sat down and ate an apple and was having a beautiful time and thinking how lucky I was to have got board in such a place with such nice folks, when I heard a queer little sound at my door. It was such a little hesitating sort of sound that it sounded more like a fumble than a knock, as if someone very timid, with very little hands, was feeling along the door, not quite daring to knock. For a minute I thought it was a mouse, but I waited and it came again, and then I made up my mind it was a knock, but a very little scared one. So I said, "Come in." But nobody came in, and presently I heard the knock again. When I got up and opened the door, thinking it was very queer, and I had a frightened feeling without knowing why. Well, I opened the door, and the first thing I noticed was a draught of cold air, as if the front door downstairs was open, but there was a strange, close smell about the cold draught. It smelled more like a cellar that had been shut up for years than out of doors. Then I saw something. I saw my coat first. The thing that held it was so small that I couldn't see much of anything else. Then I saw a little white face with eyes so scared and wishful that it seemed as if they might eat a hole in anybody's heart. It was a dreadful little face, with something about it which made it different from any other face on earth, but it was so pitiful that somehow it did away a good deal with the dreadfulness. And there were two little hands spotted purple with the cold, holding up my winter coat, and a strange little faraway voice said, "I can't find my mother." "For heaven's sake," I said, "who are you?" Then the little voice said again, "I can't find my mother." All the time I could smell the cold, and I saw that it was about the child. The cold was clinging to her as if she had come out of some deadly cold place. Well, I took my coat. I did not know what else to do, and the cold was clinging to that. It was as cold as if it had come off ice. When I had the coat, I could see the child more plainly. She was dressed in one little white garment made very simply. It was a nightgown, only very long, quite covering her feet, and I could see, dimly through it, her little thin body mottled purple with the cold. Her face did not look so cold. That was a clear waxen white. Her hair was dark, but it looked as if it might be dark only because it was so damp, almost wet, and might really be light hair. It clung very close to her forehead, which was round and white. She would have been very beautiful if she had not been so dreadful. "Who are you?" says I again, looking at her. She looked at me with her terrible, pleading eyes and did not say anything. "What are you?" says I. Then she went away. She did not seem to run or walk like other children. She flitted like one of those little filmy white butterflies that don't seem like real ones, they are so light and move as if they had no weight. But she looked back from the head of the stairs. "I can't find my mother," said she, and I never heard such a voice. "Who is your mother?" says I, but she was gone. Well, I thought for a moment I should faint away. The room got dark, and I heard a singing in my ears. Then I flung my coat onto the bed. My hands were as cold as ice from holding it, and I stood in my door and called first Mrs. Bird and then Mrs. Dennison. I didn't dare go down over the stairs where that had gone. It seemed to me I should go mad if I didn't see somebody or something like other folks on the face of the earth. I thought I should never make anybody hear, but I could hear them stepping about downstairs, and I could smell biscuits baking for supper. Somehow the smell of those biscuits seemed the only natural thing left to keep me in my right mind. I didn't dare go over those stairs. I just stood there and called, and finally I heard the entry door open and Mrs. Bird called back, "What is it? Did you call, Miss Arms?" Come up here as quick as you can, both of you," I screamed out. "Quick, quick, quick." I heard Mrs. Bird tell Mrs. Dennison, "Come quick, Amelia, something is the matter in Miss Arms' room." It struck me, even then, that she expressed herself rather queerly, and it struck me as very queer indeed when they both got upstairs and I saw that they knew what had happened, or that they knew of what nature the happening was. "What is it, dear?" asked Mrs. Bird, and her pretty, loving voice had a strange sound. I saw her look at Mrs. Dennison, and I saw Mrs. Dennison look back at her. "For God's sake," says I, and I never spoke so before, "for God's sake, what was it brought my coat upstairs?" "What was it like?" asked Mrs. Dennison in a sort of failing voice, and she looked at her sister again, and her sister looked back at her. "It was a child I've never seen here before. It looked like a child," says I, "but I never saw a child so dreadful, and it had on a nightgown and said she couldn't find her mother. Who was it? What was it?" I thought for a minute Mrs. Dennison was going to faint, but Mrs. Bird hung on to her and rubbed her hands and whispered in her ear. She had the cooingest kind of voice, and I ran and got her a glass of cold water. I tell you, it took considerable courage to go downstairs alone, but they had set a lamp on the entry table so I could see. I don't believe I could have spunked up enough to have gone downstairs in the dark, thinking every second that child might be close to me. The lamp and the smell of the biscuits baking seemed to sort of keep my courage up. But I tell you, I didn't waste much time going down those stairs and out into the kitchen for a glass of water. I pumped as if the house was afire, and I grabbed the first thing I came across in the shape of a tumbler. It was a painted one that Mrs. Dennison's Sunday school class gave her, and it was meant for a flower vase. Well, I filled it and then ran upstairs. I felt every minute as if something would catch my feet, and I held the glass to Mrs. Dennison's lips while Mrs. Bird held her head up, and she took a good long swallow, and then she looked hard at the tumbler. "Yes," says I know I got this one, but I took the first I came across, and it isn't hurt a mite." "Don't get the painted flowers wet," says Mrs. Dennison very feebly. "They'll wash off if you do." "I'll be real careful," says I. I knew she set a sight by that painted tumbler. The water seemed to do Mrs. Dennison good, for presently she pushed Mrs. Bird away and sat up. She had been laying down on my bed. "I'm all over it now," says she, but she was terribly white, and her eyes looked as if they saw something outside things. Mrs. Bird wasn't much better, but she always had a sort of settled, sweet, good look that nothing could disturb to any great extent. I knew I looked dreadful, for I'd caught a glimpse of myself in the glass, and I would hardly have known who it was. Mrs. Dennison, she slid off the bed and walked, sort of tottery, to a chair. "I was silly to give way so," says she. "No, you wasn't silly, sister," says Mrs. Bird. "I don't know what this means any more than you do, but whatever it is, no one ought to be called silly for being overcome by anything so different from other things which we have known all our lives." Mrs. Dennison looked at her sister, and then she looked at me, and then back to her sister again, and Mrs. Bird spoke as if she had been asked a question. "Yes," says she, "I do think Miss Arms ought to be told. That is, I think she ought to be told all we know ourselves." "That isn't much," said Mrs. Dennison, in a dying-away sort of sigh. She looked as if she might faint away again any minute. She was a real delicate-looking woman, but it turned out she was a good deal stronger than poor Mrs. Bird. "No, there isn't much we do know," says Mrs. Bird, "but what little there is she ought to know. I felt as if she ought to when she first came here." "Well, I didn't feel quite right about it," said Mrs. Dennison, "but I kept hoping it might stop, and anyway that it might never trouble her, and you had put so much in the house, and we needed the money, and I didn't know but she might be nervous and think she couldn't come, and I didn't want to take a man boarder. And aside from the money, we were very anxious to have you come, my dear," says Mrs. Bird. "Yes," says Mrs. Dennison, "we wanted the young company in the house. We were lonesome, and we both of us took a great liking to you the minute we set eyes on you." And I guess they meant what they said, both of them. They were beautiful women, and nobody could be any kinder to me than they were, and I never blamed them for not telling me before. And, as they said, there wasn't really much to tell. They hadn't any sooner fairly bought the house and moved into it than they began to see and hear things. Mrs. Bird said they were sitting together in the sitting room one evening when they heard it the first time. She said her sister was knitting lace. Mrs. Dennison made beautiful knitted lace, and she was reading the Missionary Herald. Mrs. Bird was very much interested in mission work, when all of a sudden they heard something. She heard it first, and she laid down her Missionary Herald and listened, and then Mrs. Dennison, she saw her listening, and she drops her lace. "What is it you're listening to, Abby?" says she. Then it came again, and they both heard, and the cold shivers went down their backs to hear it, though they didn't know why. "It's the cat, isn't it?" says Mrs. Bird. "It isn't any cat," says Mrs. Dennison. "Oh, I guess it must be the cat. Maybe she's got a mouse," says Mrs. Bird, real cheerful to calm down Mrs. Dennison, for she saw she was most scared to death, and she was always afraid of her fainting away. Then she opens the door and calls, "Kitty, Kitty, Kitty." They had brought their cat with them in a basket when they came to East Wilmington to live. It was a real handsome tiger cat, and a Tommy, and he knew a lot. And speaking of mine, we should leave the room. Apologies. Well, she called, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and sure enough, the kitty came. And when he came in the door, he gave a big yawl and didn't sound unlike what they'd heard. "There, sister, here he is. You see, it was the cat," says Mrs. Bird. "Poor kitty." But Mrs. Dennison, she eyed the cat, and she gave a great screech. "What's that? What's that?" says she. "What's what?" says Mrs. Bird, pretending to herself that she didn't see what her sister meant. "Something's got a hold of the cat's tail," says Mrs. Dennison. "Something's got hold of his tail. It's pulled straight out, and he can't get away. Just hear him yawl." "It isn't anything," says Mrs. Bird, but even as she said that, she could see a little hand holding fast to the cat's tail. Excuse me. And then the child seemed to sort of clear out of the dimness behind the hand, and the child was sort of laughing then instead of looking sad. And she said that was a great deal worse. She said that laugh was the most awful and the saddest thing she ever heard. Well, she was so dumbfounded that she didn't know what to do, and she couldn't sense at first that it was anything supernatural. She thought it must be one of the neighbors' children who had run away and was making free of their house, and was teasing their cat, and that they must just be nervous to feel so upset by it. So she speaks up, sort of sharp. "Don't you know you mustn't pull the kitty's tail?" says she. "Don't you know you hurt poor kitty, and she'll scratch you if you don't take care? Poor kitty, you mustn't hurt her." And with that, she said the child stopped pulling the cat's tail and went to stroking her just as soft and pitiful, and the cat put his back up and rubbed and purred as if he liked it. The cat never seemed quite afraid, and that seemed queer, for I had always heard that animals were dreadfully afraid of ghosts. But then, that was a pretty harmless little sort of ghost. Well, Mrs. Bird said the child stroked the cat while she and Mrs. Dennison stood watching it and holding on to each other, for no matter how hard they tried to think it was all right, it didn't look right. Finally, Mrs. Dennison, she spoke. "What's your name, little girl?" says she. Then the child looks up and stops stroking the cat and says she can't find her mother, just the way she said it to me. Then Mrs. Dennison, she gave such a gasp that Mrs. Bird thought she was going to faint away, but she didn't. "Well, who was your mother?" says she. But the child just says again, "I can't find my mother. I can't find my mother." "Where do you live, dear?" says Mrs. Bird. "I can't find my mother," says the child. Well, that was the way it was. Nothing happened. Those two women stood there hanging on to each other, and the child stood in front of them, and they asked her questions, and everything she would say was, "I can't find my mother." Then Mrs. Bird tried to catch hold of the child, for she thought, in spite of what she saw, that perhaps she was nervous and it was a real child, only perhaps not quite right in the head, that had run away in her little nightgown after she had been put to bed. She tried to catch the child. She had an idea of putting a shawl around it and going out. She was such a little thing she could have carried her easy enough, and trying to find out to which of the neighbors she belonged. But the minute she moved toward the child, there wasn't any child there. There was only that little voice seeming to come from nothing, saying, "I can't find my mother." And presently that died away. Well, that same thing kept happening, or something very much the same. Once in a while Mrs. Bird would be washing dishes, and all at once the child would be standing beside her with the dish towel, wiping them. Of course, that was terrible. Mrs. Bird would wash the dishes all over. Sometimes she didn't tell Mrs. Dennison, it made her so nervous. Sometimes, when they were making cake, they would find the raisins all picked over, and sometimes little sticks of kindling wood would be found laying beside the kitchen stove. They never knew when they would come across that child, and always she kept saying over and over that she couldn't find her mother. And they never tried talking to her, except once in a while Mrs. Bird would get desperate and ask her something, but the child never seemed to hear it. She always kept right on saying that she couldn't find her mother. After they had told me all they had to tell about their experience with the child, they told me about the house and the people that lived there before they did. It seemed something dreadful had happened in that house, and the land agent had never let on to them. I don't think they would have bought it if he had, no matter how cheap it was. But even if folks aren't really afraid of anything, they don't want to live in houses where such dreadful things have happened that you keep thinking about them. I know after they told me I should never have stayed there another night if I hadn't thought so much of them, no matter how comfortable I was made. And I never was nervous either. But I stayed. Of course, it didn't happen in my room. If it had, I could not have stayed. "What was it?" asked Mrs. Emerson in an awed voice. "It was an awful thing. That child had lived in the house with her father and mother 2 years before. They had come, or the father had, from a real good family. They had a good situation. He was a drummer for a big leather house in the city, and they lived real pretty with plenty to do. But the mother was a real wicked woman. She was as handsome as a picture, and they said she came from good sort of people enough in Boston. But she was bad clean through, though she was real pretty spoken and most everybody liked her. She used to dress out and make a great show, and she never seemed to take much interest in the child, and folks began to say she wasn't treated right. The woman had a hard time keeping a girl. For some reason, one wouldn't stay. They would leave and talk about her awfully, telling all kinds of things. People didn't believe it at first, then they began to. They said that the woman made that little thing, though she wasn't much over 5 years old, and small and babyish for her age, do most of the work when what there was done. They said the house used to look like a pigsty when she didn't have help. They said the little thing used to stand on a chair and wash dishes, and they'd seen her carrying in sticks of wood, most as big as she was many a time, and they'd heard her mother scolding her. The woman was a fine singer and had a voice like a screech owl when she scolded. The father was away most of the time, and when that happened, he had been away out west for some weeks. There had been a married man hanging about the mother for some time, and folks had talked some, but they weren't sure there was anything wrong, and he was a man very high up, with money, so they kept pretty still for fear he would hear of it and make trouble for them. And of course nobody was sure, though folks did say afterward that the father of the child had ought to have been told. But that was very easy to say. It wouldn't have been so easy to find anybody who would have been willing to tell him such a thing as that, especially when they weren't any too sure. He set his eyes by his wife, too. They said all he seemed to think of was to earn money to buy things to deck her out in. And he about worshipped the child, too. They said he was a real nice man. The men that are treated so badly mostly are real nice men. I've always noticed that. Well, one morning that man that had been there... Sorry. I can't read this sentence. Okay. Well, one morning, that man that there had been whispers about was missing. He had been gone quite a while, though before they really knew that he was missing, because he had gone away and told his wife that he had to go to New York on business, and might be gone a week, and not to worry if he didn't get home, and not to worry if he didn't write, because he should be thinking from day to day that he might take the next train home, and there would be no use in writing. So the wife waited, and she tried not to worry until it was 2 days over the week. Then she run into a neighbor's and fainted dead away on the floor. And then they made inquiries about and found out that he had skipped, with some money that didn't belong to him, too. Then folks began to ask where was that woman, and they found out by comparing notes that nobody had seen her since the man went away. But 3 or 4 women remembered that she had told them that she thought of taking the child and going to Boston to visit her folks. So when they hadn't seen her around and the house shut, they jumped to the conclusion that was where she was. They were the neighbors that lived right around her, but they didn't have much to do with her, and she'd gone out of her way to tell them about her Boston plan, and they didn't make much reply when she did. Well, there was this house shut up, and the man and woman missing, and the child. Then all of a sudden one of the women that lived the nearest remembered something. She remembered that she had waked up 3 nights running thinking she heard a child crying somewhere, and once she waked up her husband, but he said it must be the Bisbee's little girl, and that she thought it must be. The child wasn't well and was always crying. It used to have colic spells, especially at night. so she didn't think any more about it until this came up. Then, all of a sudden, she did think of it. She told what she had heard, and finally folks began to think they had better enter the house and see if there was anything wrong. Well, they did enter it, and they found that child dead, locked in one of the rooms. Mrs. Dennison and Mrs. Bird never used that room. It was a back bedroom on the second floor. Yes, they found that poor child there, starved to death and frozen, though they weren't sure she had frozen to death, for she was in bed with clothes enough to keep her pretty warm when she was alive. But she had been there a week, and she was nothing but skin and bone. It looked as if the mother had locked her into the house when she went away and told her not to make any noise for fear the neighbors would hear her and find out that she herself had gone. Mrs. Dennison said she couldn't really believe that the woman had meant to have her own child starved to death. Probably she thought the little thing would raise somebody, or folks would try to get in the house and find her. Well, whatever she thought, there the child was, dead. But that wasn't all. The father came home right in the midst of it. The child was just buried, and he was beside himself, and he went on the track of his wife, and he found her, and he shot her dead. It was in all the papers at the time. Then he disappeared. Nothing had been seen of him since. Mrs. Dennison said that she thought he had... Excuse me, there was a loud motorbike or something outside. I guess someone's getting Deliveroo. Nice. Mrs. Dennison said that she thought he had either made away with himself or got out of the country. Nobody knew, but they did know there was something wrong with the house. Please stop revving the engine. Thank you. And you folks acted queer when they asked me how I liked it when we first came here, says Mrs. Dennison, but I never dreamed why till we saw the child that night. I never heard anything like it in my life, said Mrs. Emerson, staring at the other woman with awestruck eyes. I thought you'd say so, said Mrs. Meserve. You don't wonder that I ain't disposed to speak light when I hear there was anything queer about a house, do you? No, I don't after that, Mrs. Emerson said. But that ain't all, said Mrs. Meserve. Did you see it again? Mrs. Emerson asked. Yes. I saw it a number of times before the last time. It was lucky I wasn't nervous, or I never could have stayed there, much as I liked the place and much as I thought of those two women. They were beautiful women, and no mistake. I loved those women. I hope Mrs. Dennison will come and see me sometime. Well, I stayed, and I never knew when I'd see that child. I got so I was very careful to bring everything of mine upstairs and not leave any little thing in my room that needed doing, for fear she would come lugging up my coat or hat or gloves, or I'd find things done when there'd been no live being in the room to do them. I can't tell you how I dreaded seeing her, and worse than seeing her was to hearing her say, I can't find my mother. It was enough to make your blood run cold. I'd never heard a living child cry for his mother that was anything so pitiful as that dead one. It was enough to break your heart. She used to come and say that to Mrs. Bird oftener than to anyone else. Once I heard Mrs. Bird say she wondered if it was possible that the poor little thing couldn't really find her mother in the other world. She had been such a wicked woman. But Mrs. Dennison told her she didn't think she ought to speak so, nor even think so, and Mrs. Bird said she couldn't wonder if she was right. Mrs. Bird was always very easy to put in the wrong. She was a good woman, and one that couldn't do things enough for other folks. It seemed as if that was what she lived on. I don't think she was ever so scared by that poor little ghost as much as she pitied it, and she was most heartbroken because she couldn't do anything for it as she could have done for a live child. It seems to me sometimes as if I should die if I can't get that awful little white robe off that child and get her in some clothes and feed her and stop her looking for her mother, I heard her say once. And she was in earnest. She cried when she said it. That wasn't long before she died. Now I am coming to the strangest part of all. Mrs. Bird died very sudden. One morning, it was Saturday and there wasn't any school, I went downstairs to breakfast, and Mrs. Bird wasn't there, and there was nobody but Mrs. Dennison. She was pouring out the coffee when I came in. Why, where's Mrs. Bird? Says I. Abby ain't feeling very well this morning, says she. There isn't much the matter, I guess, but she didn't sleep very well, and her head aches, and she's sort of chilly, and I told her I thought she'd better stay in bed till the house gets warm. It was a very cold morning. Maybe she's got cold, says I. Yes, I guess she has, says Mrs. Dennison. I guess she's got cold. She'll be up before long. Abby ain't one to stay in bed a minute longer than she can help. Well, we went on eating our breakfast, and all at once a shadow flickered across one wall of the room and over the ceiling, the way a shadow will sometimes when somebody passes the window outside. Mrs. Dennison and I both looked up, then out of the window. Then Mrs. Dennison, she gives a scream. "Why, Abby's crazy," says she. "There she is out this bitter cold morning, and—" She didn't finish, but she meant the child. For we were both looking out, and we saw, as plain as we ever saw anything in our lives, Mrs. Abby Bird walking off over the white snow path with that child holding fast to her hand, nestling close to her, as if she had found her own mother. "She's dead," says Mrs. Dennison, clutching hold of me hard. "She's dead. My sister is dead." She was. We hurried upstairs as fast as we could go, and she was dead, in her bed, and smiling as if she was dreaming, and one arm and hand was stretched out as if something had hold of it, and it couldn't be straightened even at the last. It lay out over her casket at the funeral. "Was the child ever seen again?" asked Mrs. Emerson in a shaking voice. "No," replied Mrs. Meserve. "That child was never seen again after she went away out at the yard with Mrs. Bird." And that is the end of The Lost Ghost, and where we go to a break. So go and do breakly things. Get up, stretch the legs you've got, or not, rotate those fluids, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes for a bit of a discussion of that, I guess, and go on to the next one. Oh, actually, no, I have a poem. I have a poem before we go to a break, yes. Sorry. Excuse me. Oh no, I was going to do it. No, I'll do this when we come back from the break. No, go take your break. Cold open back from the break, because it's nicer. Okay, I'll see you back here in 5 minutes or so. Let me get the timer going. Bye for now. A little fair Arcadian maid upon a reed once sweetly played one of those lovely tunes of old the reeds in keeping used to hold, while all around her through the glade danced golden leaves and leaves of shade, and through the boughs above her rolled the lights in drops of finer gold. And when she piped so slender sweet, would come a-scurrying to her feet the little bright-eyed hares to hear a melody so fine and clear. And rosy-footed doves would meet, and nightingales and swallows fleet, on boughs of flowering bushes near, and listen, thinking not of fear. She danced away when twilight fell, with silent reed, and broke the spell. And now her reed's as vain a thing as one that never learned to sing. And still the wee wild folk that dwell in those old woods remember well, and at the first sweet whistling would come the rush of foot and wing. And that was a read of Arcady. As we come back from the break, and Joey's back at the door, which distracted me on the last line. Where are you going to go? Because you just jumped up on the desk where you know you're not supposed to be because you walk across the laptop. Yeah. Everybody heard that. Hi. You wanna bat my face? Yeah. Hello. Right, there you go. Somewhere along the way he learned to, like, not violently, just like gently tap faces to say, hey, give me fuss. It's sort of a, I guess, like a reciprocal, like, do this, but to me. But I want to play reading with you. Yeah, hi. Hello. Yeah, you, right. He does know the internet wants cats. Yeah, if this was just like a dedicated cat stream, if like for 2 hours, well, 2 hours a week, or 4 hours a week, including Lucy's stream, I just turned the camera on and pointed it at a cat, I can't imagine the numbers we'd do. Yeah, it's fine until he does it at 3 a.m. when you're asleep. Yes. But yeah, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a fulfilling and worthwhile break. Also that you enjoyed that first story and that poem. Cat will often come and ask for affection when singing. Yes, they wait for you to be doing a thing, and that's when suddenly, ooh, I'd like some attention now. Chill cat purring to study to. Yeah, that it would work. But yeah, that was we had the Lost Ghost, which I hope everyone enjoyed. As I sort of said in chat over the break, it like right at the end, it suddenly swings hard into, oh my goodness, this is awful, and then that's sad, but it's sweet, which I like. It's sort of in keeping with the tone of, I feel, most of Freeman's other stories, that like, yeah, they're not like, ooh, spooky ghost gonna get you. There's just kind of more warmth and humanity and kind of personality there, which is nice. Oh yes, Parola, thank you. It was you, wasn't it, that like got in touch to say that I'd completely missed to put up part 4 of The Secret Garden, and I'm very sorry for that. I genuinely don't know. Yes, it was you. Thank you. It had like 6 days left on the VOD before it was just going to disappear forever, and I truly do not know how I missed it, but I had done. Yeah. So yes, thank you for catching that and for getting it to our attention. Yeah, no, I'm glad you were helpful too. Thank you very much. It's yeah, I would have just completely missed it. You only caught the last half of your swave heard. Oh, okay. Well, I can say it was called A Read of Arcady. I can actually link you, if you would like, to where I've got it. It is from, I believe, this collection called Decorative Plaques. Yeah. There's another one I picked out which I'll do another time, which I think I'm going to have to try and read the whole thing in a Scottish accent, so look forward to that. Oh, the story. Oh, right. Okay. Alright, fair enough. Well, I'm glad. Yeah, so this next one, which I'm going to get onto as Joey has now settled onto my lap, and is oh so full of purrs right now. Hello. This next one, as you can see linked at the top of chat if you already have that open, is called... It's called Sweet-flowering Perennial. And it's good. I read it earlier today, mostly. Oh, Lynn, hey, that's awesome. You had something happen to you last week which you 100% blame this channel for. You actually read the whole Secret Garden book yourself. That's really cool. Yeah, nice one. I hope you enjoyed it. Firstly, obviously, I read it. Yay, it sucked. Oh. No, that's really lovely to hear. I'm so glad. And thank you for sharing. As I say, I hope you enjoyed it. Sweet-flowering Perennial, is that me? It might be. I don't know. Oh, The Little Prince. Oh, it's been a long time since I read it, but I remember it being good. It was one that was like recommended to me as, oh, read this. Is it Antoine de Saint-Exupéry? Sorry, France. Yeah, that's good. It's a good one. Funnily enough, I'm not going to give more detail than what I'm about to say. Has come up as it has come up in a recent discussion, and I don't know whether anything will come of that discussion. But if it does, if you see anything in the next few months that reminds you of The Little Prince, I may know why. Anyway, I know I'm being painfully vague, and I just have to be at the moment. But yes, no more than that. I'm going to get on with this next story, which is called Sweet-flowering Perennial, and when messaging Lucy about this one earlier, I happened to mention that it's like, I feel like it's got slight Dracula vibes. So, look out for that, I guess. But, oh yeah, I've got to do accents again. Okay, yeah. I felt it was slipping the last one. I think when I've got to, do it constantly, I struggle and, slip between multiple different regions, some of which don't exist. So let's see how this goes here, which is more less written from the perspective of one character speaking. It's a good sentence. So yes, this is Sweet-flowering Perennial. Mrs. Clara Woods was in the bank, standing in front of the paying teller's little window, having one of her modest dividend checks cashed. She was folding the crisp notes carefully when she was startled by the voice of a man who stood next in the waiting line behind her. "May I speak to you a moment when I leave the window?" queried the voice. Mrs. Woods, turning, recognized the man as the notable fixture of humanity in Mrs. Noble's very select boarding house where she herself lived. The gentleman was wealthy, aged, and privileged, since for countless seasons he had been a feature of Noble's. The fact that Mr. Alston boarded there was Noble's best asset. "Certainly, Mr. Alston," replied Mrs. Woods, almost inaudibly, but emphasizing her agreement with a nod. She was a middle-aged woman, with nothing to distinguish her from 1,000 other middle-aged women. She stepped aside and stood by the high circular structure fitted out with paper, pens, and bank literature generally, and almost at once Mr. Alston joined her. At a slightly perceptible gesture, Mr. Alston, of course, never actually beckoned a lady to follow his lead. She went behind him or toward the rotary door of the bank, where they were almost out of hearing. Mr. Alston, in his guarded voice, spoke at once. "May I ask at what hour you left the house, Mrs. Woods?" said he. Mrs. Woods, catching a vague alarm from his manner, replied that she had left quite early. She had been shopping, and was now about to return to the house for luncheon. "I advise you not to do so," cautioned the old gentleman. Mrs. Woods gazed at him. She was frankly alarmed. "Why?" she began. "Nobles was quarantined an hour ago," said the old man. "One of the Sims children has scarlet fever. They don't dare move it in this weather, so they have nurses, and the sign is up on the front door. Mrs. Noble is distressed, but she can't help it. You had better not return for luncheon, or you will be quarantined." "I have not seen the Sims children for days and days," declared Mrs. Woods with an air of relief. "I have not even seen Mrs. Sims. Mrs. Noble told me yesterday that little Muriel was ailing and her mother was staying with her. It must have been the fever coming on." "Of course," replied Alston. "I got out, luckily, just before the notice was put up. Then I met Dr. Vane, and he told me. He advised me not to go into the house, as it might mean being a prisoner there for some time, so I got away as fast as possible. I'm going to a hotel. It is very inconvenient, but it would be more so being shut up at Noble's for days, perhaps weeks." "I think perhaps I had better not return," said Mrs. Woods hesitatingly. She was casting about in her mind exactly what she could do. Then Mr. Alston inquired if he could be of any service, and she thanked him and said no. He remarked that it would of course be very annoying and inconvenient for both of them, and went forth from the bank, while she went into the ladies' waiting room. She sat down and remained quiet, but inwardly she was aware of precisely the sensations of a wandering, homeless cat. It was, of course, rather obvious that she would either have to go to a hotel, a quiet hotel for those of her ilk, or return to Noble's and remain in quarantine. She was even inclined toward the latter, the latter course, as involving less trouble. She considered that probably the period of isolation would be limited, and that she would not seriously object to remaining housed in her own nest, rather than settle, even temporarily, in a new one. Then she suddenly reflected that little Muriel Sims was not the only child at Noble's. There were the two Dexter boys. She was almost sure that they had never had scarlet fever. There was the Willis baby. There was little Annabel Ames. Suppose all these came down with scarlet fever. Why, that might mean quarantine for months. Then also there was the noise of so many children confined to the house. Probably none of them had escaped quarantine. The little Dexter boys were very boisterous children. They would probably slide down the banisters all day. Mrs. Woods again vibrated mentally toward the hotel. Then Miss Selma Windsor entered. She did not notice Mrs. Woods. That was Selma's way. She was not apt to notice people unless she almost collided with them. Selma entered and seated herself at one of the little writing tables, took some papers from her black leather bag, and began to examine them with as complete an air of detachment as if she were entirely alone in the world. Mrs. Woods made an involuntary movement. She half rose, then she settled back. She was still entirely unnoticed by the other woman, who continued to examine her papers. She was probably about Mrs. Woods' own age. Mrs. Woods reflected upon that. "We went to Miss Waters' school, but Selma was in a higher class," she told herself. She wondered, quite impartially, whether that proved superior wits or superior age on the part of Selma. She was not astute enough to realize that Selma had very few of her own ravages of time. Selma deceived people, though not intentionally. She had no desire to look older than she need. A woman who does that is almost monstrous. Selma simply considered that certain clothes were suitable for a woman of her age, and she wore them. She also considered that a certain invariable style of hairdressing must be adopted. She adopted it. The result was that to most people she did look as old as she was. Casual observers did not recognize the fact that there were no lines in her face, that her skin was smooth, with the ready change of colour of youth, that her facial contours remained very nearly intact, that her hair had not lost its youthful thickness and warm colour. Selma was regarded by most people, as she was regarded by Mrs. Woods that morning, as a woman over the middle-age line of life. She generally wore black, and her clothes had always a slightly hesitant note as to the last mode. She wore small black hats, and her fair hair was brushed very smoothly away from her temples. None of it could be seen under the prim brim of her hat. She had removed her gloves. Mrs. Woods did not notice that the hands were as smooth as a girl's and displayed no prominent veins. She did notice the flash of a great white diamond on one finger as Selma handled the papers in a tidy, delicate fashion. She reflected that Selma was a rich woman, and how very fortunate that was, since she had never married. She remembered that Selma lived in the suburbs, in a very wealthy town. She had never visited her there. She had seen but little of her, and that little had been through chance meetings for years. They always exchanged cards at Christmas. They were on an even level of friendship which both acknowledged, but there was no intimacy. Mrs. Woods did not feel at liberty to interrupt the other woman in her scrutiny of her papers. Selma scrutinized very leisurely. Evidently something was perplexing her a little, but she did not frown at all. She simply examined and considered with a serenity which was imperturbable. At last she seemed contented. She refolded the papers, slipped the elastic band around them, put them in her leather bag, fastened it, and began to put on her gloves. Then, for the first time, she glanced about her as if she were capable of sensing anything or anybody outside of her own individuality. She saw Mrs. Woods. Evidently not expecting to see her in that particular place, she did not at once recognize her. However, she was aware that here was a woman whom she knew. She calmly regarded the other's large, rather good-looking, obvious face. Then she rose. She extended her right hand, upon which the glove was now smoothed and buttoned. "How do you do, Clara?" she said, composedly addressing Mrs. Woods by her Christian name. Then the two women sat down together on the little leather-covered divan and exchanged confidences, or rather, Clara Woods volunteered them. There was scarcely an exchange except for the trifling inevitabilities of health and weather. Clara Woods told Selma Windsor about the scarlet fever at Noble's, and how she was as one shipwrecked without the necessities of life, or compelled to return to indefinite isolation of quarantine. Selma disposed of the situation pleasantly and gracefully, and finally, "You will, of course, return with me to Laurelville this afternoon," she said. "I can supply you with everything you need. I shall be good to have you with me until the quarantine is raised." Clara Woods made only a faint demur. The proposition seemed to her fairly providential. She had not known how to afford that quiet, exclusive hotel. Her income was very limited. Then, too, there had been the apparently insurmountable problem of her belongings quarantined at Noble's. Clara Woods was a pious woman and humbly inclined to a conviction of the personal charge of the deity over her. Visions of shorn lambs and sparrows fluttering in search of suitable sites for nests floated through her mind, which was really that of an innocent, simple child in spite of her ponderousness of middle age. There was something rather lovely in her expression as she looked up into Selma's face. Clara's eyes were shining with vistas of gratitude. Selma, who was imaginative, realized it. She smiled charmingly. "I am so glad I happened to come in here today." Sorry, Joey's just moving, making sure it doesn't press any shortcuts. She said. "It seems a special providence," returned Clara ardently. And Selma heard herself practically called a special providence, and rose above her own sense of humour because she understood what was passing in her friend's mentality. The two lunched together. Then Selma had some shopping to do in one of the big stores before they took the 4:30 train to Laurelville. It was probably that little shopping expedition which started queer after-events. At least, Clara Woods always considered them queer, although sometimes she was divided between the queerness of the events and the possible queerness of herself for so estimating them. Whenever she met Selma after what happened, she looked at her with a question in her eyes which, if Selma understood, she did not attempt to answer. Whenever Clara Woods endeavoured dizzily to understand, she always got back to the ready-made frocks displayed in that great store, on the day of her meeting Selma in the bank. Clara Woods, when she stood with her friend in one of the departments, had something of the sensations which one might have had in the company of royalty, if royalty ever went shopping for ready-made clothes. There was something about Selma Windsor. It was difficult, in fact impossible, to say what that something was. She was well and expensively clad, though with that slight flatting of the fashion key, but there were hundreds of women as well clad. She had a perfect poise of manner. So had other women by the score. Clara decided that it was impossible to say what it was that awoke to alert life and attention the groups of saleswomen. Selma had no need to stand for a second hesitating, as Clara always did in such places, feeling herself in the role of an uninvited guest at some stately function. Selma was approached at once. There was, apparently, even some rivalry between the trim saleswomen. Clara wondered if Selma was known to any of these. She afterward learned that it was the first time in her life that Selma had entered that department of the store. "Anything I can show you today, ma'am?" inquired a voice, and the other women fell back. Selma expressed her wishes. She and Clara were deferentially shown to seats among the grove of dummies, clad in the latest modes, and resembling a perfectly inanimate afternoon tea style. Clara felt a reflected glory, as one thing after another was displayed to her friend, not with obsequiousness, but with really fine deference to that mysterious something. Finally the purchase was made, and then Selma and Clara were in a taxicab on their way to the station. They reached the suburban town where Selma lived about 5 o'clock. Selma had a limousine waiting for her. Clara experienced an almost childish sense of delight when she sank into the depths of its luxurious padding. Again, the innocent, if perhaps absurd, conviction of the special providence which had her in charge that day illumined her whole soul. "Well, I must say I never dreamed this morning that tonight I would be here," she remarked happily. Selma laughed softly. "We were both encountering the very delightfully unexpected," she replied. "But when I think of coming entirely without baggage—" "My clothes will fit you perfectly," said Selma. "I have a new black chiffon which I have never worn, and which you can wear at dinner tonight." "You dress for dinner?" asked Clara with an accession of childish pleasure. "Sometimes. When I am entirely alone I make no change," said Selma. "But tonight I am entertaining. A very unusual thing for me. 2 guests, my lawyer and his cousin. We have some business to discuss, and I thought we might combine a little festive occasion with it. Mr. Wheeler is a charming gentleman. His cousin I have never met. His cousin is a southerner visiting him, and I included him in the invitation. I wished at the time I had another lady, and here she is, provided most providentially." "Are they young men?" "Mr. Wheeler is not. He is of our age. He has an invalid wife. I suppose his cousin is also middle-aged. I did not inquire." By some law of sequence, not evident on the surface, Selma immediately began to talk about the costumes which they had seen that afternoon. "It is very strange how the fashions have turned into antebellum days," said she. "How much at home the few survivors of the Civil War would have felt in that crowd of dummies dressed in flounces and fichus and full petticoats." "Yes, they even wore plaids," agreed Clara. Then she added that she supposed there must be many wardrobes in which hung duplicates of those very gowns which they had seen that afternoon. "I remember my Aunt Clara showing me one exactly like that flounced plaid taffeta, except hers was a purple and green plaid, and the one in the store is blue and brown," said she. Clara noticed a queer expression on the other woman's face, which, in the light of after events, she remembered. Selma nodded. "Yes," she replied. "I dare say you were right." Her blue eyes were fixed upon the leafless trees against the sky. They had... Sorry, Joey keeps moving like he's going to jump into places that he should not jump, and it's making me nervous. They had such a curiously childish expression that the other woman laughed softly. Selma looked at her inquiringly. "You had a look in your eyes which carried me back to our school days then," said Clara. "A look in my eyes?" "Yes, there was a sparkle in them." Selma herself laughed. "I wonder sometimes if the sparkle of life is really all over for me," she said. "I cannot accustom myself to being old." Then the limousine drew up in front of Selma's rather splendid house, set back from the road in a lawn full of straw-clad rose trees. Clara looked about her with enthusiastic interest. "Come over this way, don't go up there." "What a beautiful place! And you still like roses as much as when you were a girl," she exclaimed. "Yes, I think the place pretty good, and did not hesitate much about buying it. I had always planned some day to have a country place for the sake of the roses." When Clara entered the house, her delight was increased. Had it not been sinful, she could have blessed the Lord for the disease of scarlet fever which had been the cause of her coming. Clara had, although she was commonplace, a love for the beautiful amenities of life, whose lack had irritated her. She was not a woman to say much concerning her emotions, fairly hugging herself while gazing about at the soft richness and loveliness she thought after nobles. Selma gave her a beautiful room in the front of the house. Its great windows commanded a view of the drive and the road behind the rose trees. Clara thought afterward that Selma could have had nothing planned at the time, or she would not have given her that room, from whose windows she could see, well, what she did see. Clara Woods took a bath, with a secret awe before such luxury. The bathroom belonged to her room, and was all pink and white and silver. Clara had for years been obliged to watch her chance to sneak into the one repulsively shabby, although clean, bathroom at Noble's, and she had always an uneasy impression of publicity in using it. Here it was perfect. Everything was perfect. Her room was done in dark blue with pink roses. She had a long mirror in which she could survey herself when arrayed in Selma's black chiffon. Selma's maid assisted her to don the gown, and, although she was stouter than her hostess, it fitted her well, because Selma's gowns were always very loose. Clara Woods fairly peacocked before the mirror. The maid surveyed her approvingly. She appreciated the guest's attitude. She had not entirely approved of the loan of the elegant black chiffon which her mistress had never worn, but once the deed was done, she gloried in it. Selma's maid had been with her for years, and fairly worshipped her. She gazed at the commonplace guest's reflection in the mirror, made for the time uncommonplace by the elegant costume, and a little touch which she, the maid, had given her hair, and beamed with admiration at the effect of her mistress's kindness. After Clara had gone downstairs, she hung up the visitor's street gown, and considered within herself how Miss Selma was too good to live, almost. How many women in the world would despoil themselves of their fine feathers to deck another poor feminine fowl who lacked them. However, Jane triumphed in the knowledge that not all the fine feathers could make another such ladybird as her own mistress. That evening, Selma in black and silver was adorable. She had failed to make as little of her natural advantages as she had innocently attempted. What if her fair hair were brushed so severely back? Her delicate temples were worth revealing. The high collar concealed her long, graceful throat, but did not deform it. Selma, in a high collar of silver, with a silver band around her head, was really lovely. The two gentlemen evidently admired their hostess. The cousin, Ross Wheeler from Kentucky, did not meet the expectations of either Selma or Clara. He was much the junior of his cousin, William B. Wheeler, who had charge of Selma's affairs. However, he had been recently made a partner in business by William B., and in spite of his almost boyish look and manner, he was supposed to be taken quite seriously. No, you come this way. The dinner, which was perfect, passed off triumphantly. Even poor old Clara Woods, in her elegant black chiffon, shone in her own estimation. Years ago, dinners like that had not been infrequent for her. She felt as if she were taking a blissful little trip back to her own youth. When it was all over, and the gentlemen had gone, and Selma was bidding her good night in her own room, Clara waxed fairly ecstatic. "Oh, my dear," she exclaimed fervently, "if you knew what this means to me after my years in a boarding-house, since my little fortune was lost and my poor husband passed away." Selma regarded her with self-reproach. She reflected how easy it would have been for her to give the poor soul the little change and pleasure before. It was true, though, that she had not lived long in Laurelville, only since her mother had died some 3 years before. "I am glad, Clara," Selma replied. "Now that you have found the way, there is no reason why you should not come often." "Oh, thank you," responded Clara. "I am enjoying myself as I never thought to enjoy myself this side of heaven." She sighed romantically and reminiscently. "What a very charming gentleman Mr. Wheeler, the elder Mr. Wheeler, is," said she. "Yes, I like him," agreed Selma. "I have never regretted employing him. He forgot some papers tonight, though, and we could not settle a little matter of business for which he really came out. The dinner was hardly more than incidental, although he did wish to introduce his cousin." "His cousin is a beautiful young man," declared Clara. "Yes, and he must be clever in spite of his youth, or Mr. Wheeler would not have taken him into partnership," replied Selma. Suddenly a change came over her face. Clara started. "What is the matter?" asked Selma. The change had vanished. "Nothing, only you looked suddenly not like yourself." "Did I?" responded Selma absently. She said good night, hoped Clara would sleep well, and trailed her sparkling black and silver draperies out of the room. Clara Woods stood still a moment after the door was closed, thinking. "She looked exactly as she did when she was a girl for a minute," said Clara Woods to herself. Clara was almost asleep when she heard the ring of the telephone, the upstairs one, in Selma's room. She heard Selma's voice, but could not distinguish a word. She did not try to. Clara Woods had a scorn for curiosity. She felt herself above it, and her high position was about to be sorely attacked. At breakfast the next morning, Selma announced that she was very sorry, but she would be obliged to go to New York on business on the noon train. Mr. Wheeler had telephoned, she said. "I heard the telephone ring," returned Clara. Selma started. "I fear the talk kept you awake," she said. "I held the wire quite a time." "Oh, no," said Clara. "I could only distinguish the soft murmur of voices. It did not disturb me at all. I fell quite asleep while you were talking." Selma appeared strangely relieved. Clara noticed with wonder that the look at which she had started the night before was again upon Selma's face. Selma, in her pale blue house dress was rather amazing that morning. It was not so much that she looked young in colour and contour, but the very essence of youth was in her carriage and her glance. She looked alive, as only living things which have been a short time upon the earth look alive. Her blue eyes were full of challenge. Her chin had the lift of a conqueror. Her very hair sprang from its restraining pins with the lustiness of childhood. Selma and Clara sat together lingeringly over their breakfast. Then Selma excused herself, and Clara settled herself happily in the library with newspapers and magazines. She was conscious, half fearfully, of being in a state of jubilation that she distrusted. She was of New England parentage, and involuntarily stiffened her spiritual back to bear reverses when in the midst of unusual delights. It did not seem to Clara Woods that this could last long. It seemed to her entirely too good to be true. It was not a great while before her perturbation of soul began. It was, in fact, that very noon. Selma had told her that she was going to New York on the noon train, and had apologized for the necessity of leaving her guest to lunch alone. Clara was in the room about 15 minutes before train time, when she heard the whir of Selma's car in the drive. She saw a figure step lightly into the car, and she gave a little gasp. That was surely not Selma Windsor. That was a lightly stepping girl with a toss of fair hair under a blue hat, over which floated a blue chiffon veil. The girl was clad in ultra-style. She was a companion, as far as clothes went, of that notable company of dummies in the New York store where they had been yesterday. Wide blue skirts floated around that slender figure. A loose coat of black velvet of the antebellum fashion was worn over the blue gown. The girl seated herself. Clara could not distinguish anything of her face under the loose wave of her veil, except a vague fairness of colour and grace of outline. The car whirred, and Adam, smart in his chauffeur's costume, drove rapidly around the curve of the drive. In a second, Clara saw the car in the road. Then it was out of sight. She wondered who that girl was. She looked at her watch and wondered how Selma could make her train, since she was so delayed by a visitor. Clara never doubted that the girl was a visitor whom Selma had sent home in her car. Selma must know some people in Laurelville, although she had heard her remark that she had made few acquaintances, and no friends there. This girl must be one of the acquaintances. Clara watched very idly beside her window for the return of the car and Selma's departure for her train. Presently the car returned. Adam drove directly past the curve of the drive to the garage. Clara looked at her watch. There were now only 3 minutes before the train was due. When Clara heard the broken, hollow music of the Japanese bells which announced luncheon, she went downstairs, expecting, of course, to find Selma in the dining room, and hear her announce the change of programme which had kept her at home. There was one plate laid in Clara's place on the table, and Jane stood there ready to wait. She had, somehow, the air of a sentinel on duty when Clara entered. Clara Woods was, in one respect, rather a remarkable woman. In spite of what she had seen, she said nothing. She ate her dainty luncheon, with not as much appetite as she had eaten her breakfast. She asked nothing. She said nothing, except to make the usual remarks due from guest to servant. Then she returned to her room. Therein she sat down and looked rather pale. "Who?" demanded Mrs. Clara Woods of her own stuttering intelligence. "Was that girl?" For some cause Clara Woods avoided her front windows that afternoon. She remained in her own room for some time, writing letters at the inlaid desk between the other windows which did not command the road. Then she heard the telephone bell in Selma's room, and Jane tapped at the door and informed her that Miss Selmer wished to speak to her on the long distance from New York. Selmer's room was beautiful, but rather strangely furnished for a woman of Selmer's apparent character. It was something between a young girl's room and a bachelor apartment. One surveying it, knowing nothing of its occupant, might easily have conceived that either a young girl had married a bachelor settled in his habits and brought him home to live with her people, or that the old bachelor had yielded to a young wife's girlish preferences. Certainly, white silk curtains strewn with violets, looped back with that particular shade of blue which suits the flowers, white walls with a frieze of violets tied with blue ribbons, and a marvel of a dressing-table decked with silver and crystal, were fairly absurd combined with a great lion skin in front of the fireplace, a polar bear skin in the centre of the great room, and heavy, leather-covered divan and easy-chairs. What a queer room, thought Clara. The telephone was on a little table beside Selmer's bed. The bed had a leopard skin flung over the foot, and the counterpane and pillows were of heavy yellow satin. Selmer's voice came clearly over the wire. "I am so sorry, Clara," said Selmer, "but I find I am detained. I cannot be home in time for dinner. I probably cannot be home until the 10:30 train. Jane will take care of you. I am sorry, but you will not mind." Clara replied that of course she would not mind, assured her that she was being very well cared for, bade her good-bye, and hung up the receiver. She kept on her own dress, which was a good one, for her solitary dinner. Jane waited on her as at luncheon, and she made no attempt at satisfying any wonder or curiosity which she might have felt. Jane at times cast an apprehensive glance at her. Clara felt the glance, but never met it. After dinner, she sat in the library and read the evening paper. Then she found a book which interested her, although she felt nervous and uneasy, and from time to time thought of her own humble nest at Noble's. The hours passed. She heard the automobile go out of the yard, and at the same time Jane entered the room. She asked Mrs. Woods if she could do anything for her, and looked so disturbed that Clara understood. "She wishes me to go upstairs," she told herself. With a stiff subservience to all wishes of that kind, she rose and went. She realized that it was not judged by Jane as advisable that she should be downstairs when the motor car returned from the station. She heard it as she sat in the dressing gown which Selmer had provided, continuing her letter-writing. Clara had a large circle of feminine correspondence. She expected to hear voices. She heard none. She wondered if Selmer had not returned on the 10:30 train, then dismissed the wonder as unworthy. It was none of her business. She waited a long time before she returned to the library for the book which she had been reading. She considered that there had been enough time for all mysteries with which she had no concern to settle themselves when she stole downstairs and got the book. Some of the lights had been turned off, but many were on. It was quite evident that Selmer had not returned. Jane looked in at the library door and asked if she could do anything. Clara replied, in an almost apologetic tone, that she had come down for a book. Then she heard a car speeding up the drive. Jane's face became almost agonized. Clara sped out of the library. It was years since her middle-aged feet had moved as swiftly as they did along the hall and up the stairs. She gained her own room, opened the door, turned to close it, and saw the face of the girl coming upstairs. Clara could not help that one glimpse, but it was so fleeting that nobody on the stairs, Jane, came after the blue-clad figure, saw anything but the flirt of the closing door. Clara sat down helplessly. Always before her eyes was the face she had seen, the face of the blue-clad girl ascending the stairs. The face was fair and sweet, so sweet of expression that it compelled admiration for that alone. It was smiling radiantly. Soft, fair hair tossed over the forehead as innocently and boldly round the temples as a baby's. Clara Woods remembered Selma Windsor when she looked like that, exactly like that. The likeness was uncanny. Clara had little imagination, or she would then have gone far in imaginative fields. She did tell herself that the girl looked enough like Selma to be her own daughter. She went no further. Clara went to bed. She could not sleep. She rose early, and after dressing sat in her room waiting for sounds in the house to denote that other people were astir. At the breakfast hour she went downstairs. She was aware of a queer unsteadiness. She could not analyze her perturbation, but felt helpless before it. When Clara entered the breakfast room, Selma greeted her from a little conservatory beyond. She had been tending a few blooming plants, which she kept there. Selma said, "Good morning," and there was nothing unusual in her manner. There was nothing unusual in Clara's, although she looked pale. Breakfast was served, and she and Selma partook of it, and the mysterious girl did not appear, and was not mentioned. Selma said nothing about her trip to New York, except to express regret that Clara had been left to dine alone. Selma, eating breakfast, did not look in the least tired. On the contrary, Clara thought she looked, in some strange, intangible fashion, younger and fresher. Her voice rang silvery. She laughed easily and delightfully. "You seem just as you did when we were girls together at school," Clara exclaimed involuntarily. Then Selma gave a quick start, but recovered herself directly. "Those were the happiest days of my youth, those days at school," she said, and there was a sad note in her voice. Clara did not reply. She had known very little about Selma, except through those days at school. Selma began to talk more freely than she had ever done. She told how her home life had been saddened, even embittered, by an older sister who was an invalid. One of those kickers against the pricks who drag all who love them into their own abyss of misery. Selma and her father and mother had been as beaten slaves under the sore tyranny, which had endured until the sister died, long after Selma's youth had passed. "I never," she said, "could have company of my own age. I never could go like other young girls." She flushed slightly. "I could not have a lover on account of poor Esther," she said. Then she added, with a curious naivete, "I've always wondered what it would be like." Jane brought in hot waffles, and the personal conversation ceased. After breakfast, the two women went upstairs. It was a windy morning. Selma's door was blown open as they reached it, and a sudden puff of wind caused a skirt to flash out with a sudden surprise of blue, like a bird of spring from an open closet door. Selma did not act as if she saw it. Clara again felt shaken and proceeded to her own room, telling Selma she had some letters to write. In her room she sat down and pondered. She might not own to curiosity. Other people's affairs might be sacred in her estimation, but she could not ignore, in the privacy of her own consciousness, the blue flirt of that skirt. After a while, however, she gained command over herself, with her usual incontrovertible argument that it was none of her business. She went downstairs, and Selma provided her with some fancy work, and the two visited serenely all the forenoon. After luncheon, they separated. Clara had a habit of lying down for an hour. This afternoon she fell asleep, the effect of her wakeful night. She started up about 4 o'clock. She had heard a motor in the drive. Against her own will she slipped down from the divan and peered out of the window. There was a great touring car and a magnificent chauffeur, and Mr. William B. Wheeler's handsome young cousin was assisting into the tonneau the girl, clad this time in fawn colour, ruffling to her waist, with a quaint velvet mantle to match, fitch furs, and a fawn-coloured poke bonnet with a long feather curling to her shoulder. The car sped away. Clara really felt faint. She lay down again on the divan. It crossed her mind that she might go in search of Selma and see if she were in the house. Then she dismissed the thought as unworthy. The very soul of small honour had Clara Woods. She immolated herself upon that little shrine, which most women would not have considered a shrine at all. Clara finally dressed herself and then hurried downstairs to the library, whose windows did not command the drive. There she read conscientiously. Finally, Selma came in, smiling. Clara noticed guiltily that her cheeks were flushed as if by coming in contact with cold outdoor air. It was curious that Clara was the one who felt guilty before all this. Selma seemed entirely unruffled until Clara inquired if they were to dress for dinner that night, if guests were expected. Suddenly, Selma flushed. She looked for 1 second like a young girl trapped with some love secret. Then she answered composedly that she expected nobody, and it was not necessary to dress. There was a tap on the door, and Adam entered. He wished to see his mistress with regard to preparing a new garden patch. Selma excused herself. When she returned, she was smiling happily. "I shall have a lovely new garden this year," she said. "I have bought half an acre at the left of the house, and I am to have a flower garden. A flower garden with a stone wall around it. A wonderful flower garden." "What kind of flowers?" inquired Clara, and was surprised at the intensity and readiness of her friend's reply. "Perennials," she exclaimed with force. "Always perennials. Always the flowers which return every year of their own accord. I like no other flowers. Always the returning flowers, roses and lilies and hyacinths and narcissi and hollyhocks. There are plenty of them. No need for us to trouble ourselves with flowers which demand taking up and gathering and replanting. It is always a perennial flower for me. I love a rose which has returned to its own garden home year after year. There is faithfulness and true love and unconquerable youth about a flower like that." Clara stared at her. "I suppose so," she assented rather vaguely. Selma puzzled her in more ways than one. However, a perfectly pleasant little conversation ensued. Selma asked about some old school friends of whom Clara had kept track through the years. The solitary dinner passed off happily. The two separated rather early. Selma owned to having a slight headache. Clara read a while, then went to bed. She was just beginning to feel drowsy when she heard a motor in the drive, and simultaneously she noticed a thin line of light across her floor. She had not quite closed her door. Somebody had turned on all the hall lights, and they shone through the crack. It was too much for Clara Woods. Curiosity raised and would not be subdued. She slid noiselessly out of bed and stood behind the door. She peered through that slight opening and saw the girl, all clad in rose colour, a full skirt blossoming around her, ribbons and laces fluttering. She beheld the girl fairly dancing on slim, pointed feet along the hall toward the stairs. At the same time, the fragrance of roses came to her, and she remembered how fond Selma used to be of that perfume, and how the other girls used to make fun of her for using it in such quantities. All the hall was now scented with roses. There might have been a garden of them. Clara closed her door noiselessly and went back to bed. That night she was so tired that she slept. The next morning she wondered if the girl would appear at the breakfast table, but there was only Selma in a lavender morning gown, sweet and dignified and serene as ever. Whatever there was to conceal, Selma was careless, for again when Clara went upstairs, Selma had gone out with her gardener to give directions for her garden of perennials. Selma's door was open, and over a chair lay a fluff of rose pink and lace and ribbons. Clara shook her head. She went into her own room and she thought of Noble's. She had lived there over 10 years, and nothing in the least mysterious had happened. She wished herself safely back, But again she stifled her curiosity. She stifled it, and, in fact, never quite knew if it had been gratified, if she ever found out the truth of the case. Clara had always a mild wonder if a cleverer woman than she might have known exactly what had happened, what did happen. For the climax of the happening came very soon, and it came in an absurd sort of fashion. Selma had been busy in her own room all the afternoon. Clara had not seen her since luncheon. Finally, she dressed in one of the costumes which had been placed at her disposal, a pretty black net trimmed with jet, and went downstairs to the library. After trying a book which did not especially interest her, she settled herself comfortably in a long lounging chair beside a window. Although the day was far spent, it was not dark. Clara lay back, gazed out of the window at the grounds, and reflected. Where she sat, she could see, mirrored in a picture facing the large drawing-room into which the library opened, the two actors in the little drama of mystery. She could not help seeing them unless she moved, which was quite out of the question. Clara stared at the reflecting surface of the picture facing the interior of the drawing-room, and she saw Mr. William B. Wheeler's cousin, the charming young man from the south, enter and seat himself. She saw in the picture that he was very pale and evidently ill at ease. Then Selma entered. To Clara she looked much older than usual. Her black satin gown was very plain. Her fair hair was strained back very severely from her temples. She also looked pale and worn. Clara saw Selma and the young man shake hands. Then, with no preamble, he was hardly more than a boy, he sank down on his knees before the woman, buried his face in her black satin lap, and his great boyish frame shook. Then Clara heard the boy say, chokingly, "Forgive me, Miss Windsor, I am hard hit." Clara saw Selma's face, bent over the bowed, fair head, pityingly, like the face of a mother. The young man went on, "You must know that I understand how very odd this may all seem to you. I have only seen her those few times, but from the very first minute she entered Cousin William's office that morning after we dined here, when he had telephoned you and you had sent your niece to represent you because you were ill, from that very first minute it was all over with me. She was so sweet and kind. She stayed and went to that concert with me, although I know she feared lest you think she ought not. Everything happened so quickly. She was not at fault. She never encouraged me, led me on, you know. You surely don't think I am such a cad as to imply that, Miss Windsor?" Clara heard Selma's reply. "No, I certainly do not mean to imply that." The boy went on. "I know I was terribly headlong. I have always been headlong. It is in my blood. And I was so sure of myself. She was so wonderful. Then I wrote her a note. Did you see it? She showed it to you, didn't she? I expected, of course, she would." Clara saw Selma bow her head in assent. "Then she sent that special delivery note of refusal. You saw that?" Selma again bowed her head. "Do you think it was final?" "Will it never be any hope?" cried the young fellow with a great gasp. Clara heard Selma say, "No," in a strange voice. "There is no use in my asking her," pleaded the boy pitifully. "She has gone," replied Selma. "And she is not coming back?" "I doubt if she ever comes back." Clara saw the fair head of the young man on Selma's black satin lap. She saw the broad young shoulders heave. She saw Selma Windsor put her hand lovingly on the fair hair and stroke it, and murmur something which she did not catch. But soon the young man stood up, and his white face was lit by a brave smile. "Oh, of course, Mrs. Windsor," he said. "It is all the fortune of life and love and war. Of course I have courage enough to take what comes. Of course I'm not beaten. Of course I'm young and shall get over it. I'm not a coward. I simply did love her so, and it is the first time I was ever hit so hard. It is all right. I'm sorry that I have troubled you. It is all right, but I am going back to Kentucky tonight. I am going into business with a fellow of my own age. I have told Cousin William. He was upset, and I did not tell him why I was backing out of the partnership so soon. He did not like it very well. I am sorry, for he is a mighty good sort, but I have to go. I have plenty of fight in me for everything, but a fellow has to choose his own battlefield sometimes. I am ashamed of myself, to tell you the truth, Miss Windsor. Your niece is wonderful, but I never thought any living girl could settle me as soon as this. She is wonderful, though. Clara saw in the picture the young man gazing intently at Selma Windsor. You must have looked much like her when you were a girl, he said. Yes, I think I did, replied Selma. Then Clara saw the two make what was apparently an involuntary movement, and Selma had kissed the young man, and he had held her for a second like a lover. Then Clara did close her eyes. She remembered when it was all over except the fervent goodbyes and kind wishes which the two exchanged. Clara heard the door close behind the boy. She heard Selma leave the drawing-room, and soon, in the now fast-fading light, she saw her talking with Adam over the flower garden in which she was to have her perennial blooms when spring and summer came again. Clara seized her opportunity. She made her retreat all unseen to her own room. When later she and Selma met at dinner, everything was as usual. After dinner they had a pleasant evening. The two ladies played a game of patience. Nothing more which savoured of the mysterious happened during Clara's visit. She remained until the quarantine at Noble's was lifted. She enjoyed herself thoroughly. She visited Selma again rather often, spending weekends. They were closer friends than they had ever been, and Clara never knew the explanation of what she had unwittingly seen and heard. It suited her obvious mind better to believe that a niece of Selma's had really been in the house, and had a love affair, and, for some unexplainable reason, had been concealed from her. She had not the imagination to conceive of the other possibility, that some characters, like some flowers, may have within themselves the power of perennial bloom, if only for an hour or a day, and may revisit with such rapture of tenderness that it hardly belongs to earth, their own youth and springtime, in the never-dying garden of love and sweet romance. And that is the end of the Sweet-flowering Perennial. Thank you for listening. But not the end of the stream, because now we get to sit and chat for a bit. Hello. Yeah, it's quite a lovely one, that one, isn't it? I like it. And say, I don't know if anyone else got the same kind of feeling, but like, yeah, just while I was reading it earlier, it's just kind of ever so slight kind of Dracula vibes, I guess, is what I feel like. Not in the, oh, here's a spooky, predatory, like, weird person, but just, I don't know, the kind of her finding herself through different circumstances stuck in this house with someone who doesn't entirely seem to be as first presented, who kind of keeps disappearing out on strange errands, except this time instead of going and like eating kids, it's because her age keeps shifting, kind of like a nicer, more wholesome Dracula, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I like that one. It's nice. And I hope that you have enjoyed it too. Yeah. So I don't know. Dracula on holiday. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Thank you. That's, yep. Okay. Dave is still going. All right. I'm just sort of looking to see whomst I wish to raid in a bit. I see another possible target, which would be really weird. As an old friend of mine is streaming Tears of the Kingdom, He doesn't stream often, but for some reason today he decided that he would, and I'm kind of tempted. But no, I think I shall get ready to send us over to Dave. Like moving into a haunted house and the ghost keeps knocking things down, trying to make you tea. And yeah, Perola, you got a bit of the vampire vibe. Yeah, exactly. Like it's Dracula but with flowers. Yeah, that's the thing. It's like she's not. I was when I was reading it first, I was wondering whether it was going to be that she, again, like the earlier kind of lich-like character, whether she's kind of draining the life force from the people that she invites into the house. But no, she's just kind of lonely and looking for a friend, and yeah. Oh yeah, and you're welcome, everyone. I enjoy reading these. I especially enjoy when it's stories that I like a lot, and there's that aspect of sharing something that I enjoy with other people. Ugh, excuse me. Put you in mind of a Dorian Gray situation. Also, yes, that too, actually, yeah. So I would be interested. I'd be interested to see when. This was published in 1915. Yeah, chronologically, when that actually lines up with the other stories that it's kind of similar to. In that sense, not yeah. This isn't some kind of but you ripped it off, but just like whether there were like a few stories along those kinds of themes all published in sequence. Dorian Gray, but not a sociopath. I've not actually read Dorian Gray, but I will. I think Lucy was planning to read it at some point. You're wondering there was some life-sucking thing going on, but you guess not. Yeah, exactly. And I almost like the Get Out explanation of. Were you? I thought you said you might be. I don't know. Maybe. I feel like it's come up on our lists. But yeah, I like the sort of the out that she gave herself of having someone who she's like, well, she's perhaps not the brightest penny in the piggy bank. So she's just going to take it at face value that yeah, perhaps there is just some mysterious child who looks exactly like the person that I know when she was a kid running around, and not anything more untoward going than that. Just dust her hands and walk off. Just this is a bit weird. Anyway, so yeah, I kind of like. Well, I don't have to go into the full details of the explanation. There's this lady who sort of flowers yearly like a rose, but Clara's resolute in curiosity. None of my business, not going to pry. Exactly. It's like, yeah, I'm fine with that. It's like there's again that story, and there's been like a couple others. It just feels it's not a serious story, and I feel like she knew that. There's just like remarks and asides and little comments in there that just feel like she's having fun with this one. She's just enjoying telling this story and being just a little bit sarcastic about these characters, and I like it. It's very interesting to follow her thoughts. Yes, and sometimes you have to not out your friends. Agreed. There was what was it? There was like a page that I folded. There was a line. I mean, I appreciated at the start when she was like, oh, well, I could, if there's a quarantine going on at the hotel, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to be stuck in a hotel. It's what it's going to be. I mean, obviously, we're all looking at that thinking, haha. But when she's like, yeah, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to be stuck in my little bedroom nest of a hotel for like a week or two. Oh, but there's kids. And I find it funny that, again, like looking over Wilkins Freeman's work, like a lot of her poems seem to be written for kids, and the fact that so many of her characters seem to be like teachers of children and stuff. Like she herself seemed to have like a great fondness for children. I don't know how true that is, but that's the impression I get from her work. But for her to have this character who's just like, oh yeah, noisy kid sliding down banisters. Nope, I'm out. I will take whatever problems that brings. I'm not doing that. Yeah, there was. Oh, damn it! Where was it? There was another line. I marked the page and I can't find where it was. But yeah, I say it every week. I really enjoy her writing. I really like the way she just like handles these characters. No, if I sit and just read silently, that's going to be a really boring few minutes. So instead, what I'm going to do is not do that. He says, absolutely still doing that. Yeah, no, not got it. But yeah, I'm going to... Like, timing this is going to be real difficult, so I'm just going to like get the raid command. First step is admitting there's a problem. Yes. Extremely real. I've got one more poem that I'm going to read and send you out with. So I have got that ready, and then I'm going to send you over to Dave. So in the middle of this, whilst reading, I'm going to try and coordinate that. So if anything goes wrong, that's why. That's all. The only and sole reason. Not that reading is difficult sometimes. But yeah, I guess I'll outro a bit first. Thank you all for being here. Extremely grateful and appreciative as ever to have people that tune in to listen to this. Whether first screen, second screen, VOD, background, whatever. Sincerely, from both myself and Lucy, thank you for being here. For like the subs that happen, and just the audience for being here, chatting, not chatting, lurking is also just as welcome. We are super grateful, and it's what helps encourage us to keep going. So yeah, thank you very much. Do come back on Wednesday, when I believe Lucy will be planning to read more of The Secret Garden. And in theory, next Saturday, although because I won't be here where I'm sort of most comfortable streaming, I don't know, we'll see. I will plan to and intend to next Saturday, but it's possible that one might get disrupted, I don't know. But yes, do please be around for those. As ever, if you would like to get the most update going live information, that is primarily what we use our Twitter account for. I should probably use it for more social media posting, but frankly, Twitter feels like it's going down the toilet, and I don't know there's much worth in really trying to do much more there. But yeah, come back on Wednesday for that. Check out the Bandcamp if you would like. If you would like to hear some like better recordings of stuff we've already done, check out the YouTube for this grade of recording, complete with interruptions and cat noise, burps and all. And yeah, we will see you on the next one. But before we go, I have for you another poem, one last one, that is called The Fisher-Maiden. What she caught, this Fisher-Maiden, with her blowing yellow curls? Why, her net, so runs the story, full of emeralds and pearls, and some broken bits of glory from the rainbows in the river, which the sunlight of a morning wakes and links and sets a quiver. All their silver fins a winking, shot the groups of fishes past. Right and left the jewels dashing, down her little net she cast. Up the emeralds came flashing, with the pearls and rainbows ever, but the pretty silver fishes tangled in amongst them, never. One would think this Fisher-Maiden, with her blowing yellow curls, might have liked the bits of glory, and the emeralds and pearls. But all day, so runs the story, since she had such paltry wishes, there she sat, beside the river, fishing, all in vain, for fishes. Thank you for listening, and good night.